Welcome, everyone, to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. A quick note before we start, this session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube with a link from our website at ICSSmarx.org within the next few days. Before the pandemic, this weekly program was hosted at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library, located in Oakland, California, USA. During the pandemic, we have been meeting every Sunday morning on Zoom. So because of this, we should say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from the Marxist Library, because we now have attendees from throughout the United States and even around the world. We've been offering Sunday morning programs for over a decade and a half. You can sign up for email notifications for future programs, view past programs, and contact us through our website at ICSSmarx.org. We always welcome input, feedback, suggestions for topics, and speakers. My name is Alan Miller, and I'm a member of the program committee that organizes Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. Before we start, we wish to remind everyone that this is a comradely forum for political discourse and debate. As such, we ask that you show respect for our participants and the moderator of today's session. Please note that the opinions expressed here are those of the speaker and participants. They do not necessarily represent the ICSS or the Marxist Library. However, we are united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, and we believe that his work remains relevant today. Our motto is taken from Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Our session today is how the United States is preparing for imminent war with China. Our speaker, KJ No, is a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region. We will have approximately a 1-hour presentation followed by a short break, followed by questions and comments from session participants until 12:30 p.m. Pacific time. And with that, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to KJ for joining us today. Thank you, KJ. Take it away.
Thank you, Alan. Pleasure to be with you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very, very honored to be amongst our comrades here. And many of you may know I have a long affiliation with the NPML. So glad to be back with comrades and at the home base. I want to share today, I want to start out today by showing you about an 8-minute film filmed in the 1950s. And I think that will kind of set the context for where we are. So without further ado,
It was a quiet country in 1945. I was here as a war correspondent when the Americans came over to accept the surrender of Jap troops below the 38th parallel. I remembered how restful the green rice paddies looked. The peaceful villages and towns like Taiwan. It didn't amount to much, like any small town anywhere, but it was home to these people. Seoul was different. It was a big town, the capital city, with 1.5 million people. And they were all gay. Seoul was celebrating freedom after 40 years of Jap rule, of Russian interference under the Tsars, and centuries of Chinese domination. It was gay for these Americans, too. Every GI was a symbol of liberation to the natives. I learned something about Koreans. I learned that these people, so remote from us, strange even to their fellow Asiatics, were simple human beings who wanted to live in peace and independence. They took me around their colorful 500-year-old city, showed me the buildings they were proud of, the Capitol, the Fine Arts Museum, Changdeok Palace, Dak-su, the Chosen Bank Building. It was a city of seas, an oriental blend of the ancient and modern. I remembered it all when I came back to Korea 5 years later, again as a war correspondent, again with American and other United Nations troops. I was glad I remembered because so much of it was gone. The towns, the public buildings, the people destroyed by war. This time the liberation had to be fought for, bitterly, heartbreakingly. This time there was no celebration and no gaiety. Tanks, not floats, paraded in the streets. And the air was filled with bullets, not confetti. For months, death and destruction ran amok in Korea. War is a wanton destroyer of property and lives. This shattered body, this burning hut, are tragic symbols of the havoc war creates. Even men of goodwill must fight fire with fire, must kill and destroy to bring a swift end to death and destruction. Our soldiers learned early, however, that in this battle there were terror and savagery. These were their comrades in arms, prisoners of the communists, shot with their hands tied behind their backs near Wegwan. This was Taiwan, when our counterattacking forces breaking out of their Pusan bridgehead retook the town, what there was of it. Taiwan was razed, leveled, with Manila or Warsaw. These men, women, and children were not killed accidentally in the heat of battle. They were murdered, cold-bloodedly, deliberately. Butchered to spread terror, to warn the survivors that if you didn't let the communist monster swallow you alive, he'd rather have you dead. The horror of Taiwan was only a pale reflection of Seoul, where a great city, the heart of a nation, was ravaged. Brilliant leadership and the hammer blows of a great fighting team, the Navy, Air Force, Army, and Marines, working with other United Nations forces, had snapped the spine of the North Korean aggressor. The enemy was paralyzed, but communist fanaticism was determined that if it must perish, it would destroy what it could. Devouring these brave men, slaughtering the innocent, ruining, wrecking, laying waste. The public buildings that served as the nerve center of this capital city were gutted shells scooped out by fire and explosion. The factories became funeral pyres of this poverty-stricken people's hard-won hopes for economic betterment. These ashes were our receipt for the hundreds of millions of dollars, the years of patient teaching of industrial techniques we'd lavished here. But Seoul was not unique, any more than Taiwan. Our Our troops advancing from north and south found that only the place names were different. Bury at Wonju, Chongju, Mokpo, Suchon, Yangpyeong. Burning farms, shattered homes, blasted shops. And everywhere lay the murdered dead. The scenery of destruction is monotonous. Atrocity stories keep repeating themselves. How can I tell you? What can I show you of the 10,000 human beings slaughtered in Seoul? Perhaps it isn't exactly 10,000. Perhaps the total figure right now is approximate, if that makes any difference. In time, we'll get a careful tabulation. We'll learn the exact number of the slaughtered, down to the last corpse. Of course, some atrocities will not be counted at all, because they were perpetrated on the living. Atrocities of the spirit. The heartbreak. The shattered families. The broken lives. All the dead, however, will be certified by the United Nations Commission on Korea. Each case will be thoroughly documented. The doubters and the cynics, the hard-boiled sophisticates who scoffed at the stories of Dachau and Buchenwald and called it propaganda will be able to check the record if they wish. The slayers of our soldier dead, 1 out of every 20 Americans were killed as prisoners of war, will be remorselessly tracked down wherever possible and brought to judgment. But what of the greatest atrocity of all, the instigation of this wanton war? What of the cynical murderers who ordered it? What penalty for them? This need never have been. These honored dead need never have sacrificed their lives for American honor and good faith. These cities, these homes need never have been destroyed. These primitive North Koreans, these misguided fools need never have been led to the slaughter. Their minds and emotions set ablaze by false promises and giant lies, perverted by those who would make all mankind their dupes in their lust for world control. This communist imperialism is the real criminal. Its crime in Korea was a mistake, a costly one. Not for them, for us. We paid, and the people of Korea paid. Because we refuse to see the criminal threat. Killed and fighting hard defeated the threat in Korea.
Anyway, I think that's enough of that. As you can see, it is very, very, it's clearly propaganda, and it resonates with the current moment because there's so much of that which applies to the current moment. I have a quick question for people, and you can unmute yourselves briefly. Does anybody know who the voice in that documentary was?
No.
Yes, that's correct, Kit. It is Humphrey Bogart. Okay.
Ooh.
So they're pulling out all the stops here. Okay. Now, the reason why I brought up this film is the film is from beginning to end, almost every word, every frame, every image is some kind of fabrication. When you see the mass graves, the mass slaughters, and they attribute those to North Korea, we have good authoritative evidence that shows that these were committed by the South Koreans, or actually the South Koreans under US military control and observation. And they form part of what are referred to as the Porto League massacres, which was simply the mass slaughter of anybody that the South Koreans considered to be even nominally leftist. But here in this movie, Bogart is attributing them to the North. So the US instigated these slaughters, they filmed them, and then they attributed them to the North Koreans. The other thing is you see lots of images of bombings. Now, the thing to understand is that the US did a near genocidal level of carpet bombing against North Korea, and also in the South as the battlefront shifted, and it killed off, according to certain estimates, between 20 to 30% of the population. People say that the country was a moonscape; nothing was left standing. Tibor Mire, who was a Hungarian journalist, said that traveling through North Korea was like traveling on the surface of the moon. There was nothing left standing. And so once again, Bogart is attributing this to North Korean bombing. Well, that is absurd. North Korea had a minimal, tiny fighter fleet. They had, I think at the time, probably 32 trained pilots. And so all of this is a world upside down. But this is the kind of stuff that you get when you move towards war. You get absurdities that prepare you for atrocities, or that justify atrocities. And everything you hear is upside down and backwards. Yes, and I agree with Keith. It is very, very similar to what we also see the reporting around the war in Ukraine. So, the key point that I want to make, and this is the point that I'll make, and then we can get into the granular details later, is I believe the United States is very, very close to war with China. It has actually given us a timeline or a deadline, and it places that deadline somewhere within the next 2 years. It claims that China is the belligerent and that the US will need to prepare to go to war against China. But clearly, the US is the belligerent, and it is the US which is on a precipitated timeline. And this has to do with the fact that there are good studies out of RAND that show that if the US does not wage war with China by 2025, there is no guarantee of winning. Also, its key allies are actually in a weakened state, and so time is of the essence. So inside that context, there are 3 things that you can note. The first is, as I pointed out, the extraordinary propaganda. It's the level of propaganda, the kind of information warfare, which is really just a subkinetic or a prekinetic dimension of hybrid war, has reached a fever pitch. Most recently, the balloons, but everything, and of course TikTok, but anything and everything that China is doing is escalated to the level of imminent threat. And when we say imminent threat, of course, this is how war propaganda works. War propaganda usually focuses on 2 aspects. One is threat, that the enemy is an imminent, dangerous, existential threat, WMD. In the case of China, They're responsible for leaking the COVID, which created a worldwide biological catastrophe. 66% of the US population believes currently that China leaked the COVID virus, and that 44% believe that it did so deliberately. Once again, this is WMD level propaganda saturation. The other thing that we can note is the actual movements and exercises that are happening. So if you look at the statements, but if also look at the positioning and the military exercises, the tone of the military exercises has changed completely. Before, when countries did multilateral military exercises, they would always kind of frame them in some kind of non-martial way or some kind of pretext. Now all of that is out the window. They're actually preparing for war. They're naming China as the enemy. These exercises are very, very specific. And there's also massive levels of logistical preparation happening. This is most recently attested by the leak of General Minihan's memo to his staff, his troops, to his 50,000 troops. And remember, Minihan is the general responsible for airlift logistics. And those of us who have been in the military, we know that you can disregard the politicians, but you never disregard the logistics people. The logistics people know what is happening. And Minihan has said that the United States will be at war with China within the next 2 years. He calls it a gut instinct, but you don't send an email telling your soldiers, your troops, to prepare for war, to prepare to kill and to be killed and to get their affairs in order. You don't do that on just a gut instinct. The other thing I think that is worth noting, and for me, it is the piece that I think affects us most directly, is the fact that there is such an extraordinary level of violence against Asians currently in the United States. And the reason for this, once again, I will share my, I'll share my screen. I apologize for the delay. So you see, what I note here is that there are random rage killings of Asians currently. And that is a very, very worrisome phenomenon, because what it really means is that when you have this level of random rage killing, what it really means is that the fat in the pan is smoking, that killing of Asians is acceptable. And that trickles down to the lowest level of your, mentally ill person, but they understand that this is acceptable. And people say, well, they're just mentally ill. No, the mentally ill, in a certain sense, are like the canary in the coal mine. They are very, very attuned to the general streams of what are being general messages that are in the media. And so I see these random rage killings as a signal that we are ready for war. As we said, there's an epidemic of attacks. I argue that these racist attacks on Asians are inseparable from the warmongering on China. Just last Sunday in San Francisco, a young Asian teen had his throat slashed in broad daylight on a Muni bus. They say it was completely unprovoked. He is in critical condition. Asian man was beaten to death by 8 girls in Vancouver several months ago. There's an endless number. Almost everybody I know who is Asian has had some kind of threat or assault. And this is in the quote unquote progressive Bay Area. There are hundreds of Asian grandmothers who are afraid to leave their apartments. They're so paralyzed by fear that they will be assaulted and attacked. This one is especially sad. This is a young Asian Miao or Hmong girl, and she was chased, gang raped, and she was beaten to death. As she was being killed, one of the assailants said, "I love raping chink bitches." Okay, so that gives you a sense of where we are in terms of the mindset. And once again, we can individualize and pathologize this, but we have to understand this in a much larger context. When you have a wholesale policy of hate mongering, it trickles down into retail violence. We've seen this over and over again historically. And right now, Asians, especially East Asians, are collateral damage. And so this is all over the place. You know, there's no end to this. There's no end to the kind of hate mongering and propagandistic lies. And as I said, they all tie back into this mindset of creating fear and hatred and tapping into, you know, actually even our best sentiments. That is to say, they tap into our sense of compassion and empathy. This is, you know, where we are, quote unquote, worried about, the future of the ethnic minorities in China who are being genocided. Again, absolutely no proof. You know, the Uyghur population has increased 3.3 times. They were originally somewhere in the range of 3.6 million. They're now over almost 12 million. It makes the 5th largest Turkic community, or actually the 4th largest Turkic community outside of China. Their life expectancy has doubled. They were exempt from the One China policy. There's preferential treatment in education and in hiring. They get to use their language, their customs are preserved, their religion, all of this is preserved. But just as we saw in the movie, everything is inverted and everything is shifted, transformed into the lie. Marx once spoke of in the German ideology of the camera obscura of ideology. And he said that essentially what happens is that it's almost as if we are being kept inside a dark room and there's a pinprick through which the light comes through. And this pinprick, he referred to as ideology, but we can see it as ideology filtered through the media. So there's a tiny pinprick of light that comes through, and the image that it projects on the wall is completely inverted. Okay, so that's what we're getting right now. And as I said, once again, the farther we move away from the truth, the closer we are for war. So I want to talk about 4 different areas where I think that are especially worrisome. One is Japan. Japan is remilitarizing. Now, Japan has wanted to remilitarize since 1955. In fact, it's wanted to remilitarize since 1945, since its surrender. But in 1955, the United States created this party called the LDP. And it was a consortium of the impenitent imperialist war criminals of the Japanese military. The old fascist war criminals came together and they allied with the Yakuza, the Japanese gangster class, and they were supported by the CIA to the tune of millions. And through this consortium and collaboration, they essentially created a one-party state that has held power until the current moment. There's been very, very short moments when Japan was not controlled by the LDP. The LDP is essentially a US client party. It's a client quisling party. Japan is a quisling state, and it does the bidding of the United States. Its goals align with the United States in the sense that these imperialists have always wanted to remilitarize, and now the US is allowing them to do so. The Article 9 is de facto neutered. The US has let the inmate out of the penalty box, and it is letting the felon rearm itself. It's giving weapons back to the felon. It's going to sell 500 Tomahawk missiles to Japan as part of its quote unquote counterstrike capacity. But anybody knows anything about the military aspects of it is that you know that Tomahawk missiles, which are strategic weapons or can be strategic weapons, are not used for counterstrike. They simply don't have the dynamics or the characteristics for counterstrike capacity. They are offensive weapons designed to penetrate deeply into Chinese territory and assault it with assault in decapitation attacks. So that's one element. And Japan is also remilitarizing. It's doubling its military budget. Japan is already the 5th most powerful military on the planet, and that is as a pacifist state. When it doubles its military budget, it will have the 3rd largest military budget on the planet after the US, China. It will be Japan. Okay, so there's a massive remilitarization going on. And of course, it is looping up with Korea, with South Korea, which has essentially decided to become a vassal partner of Japan and the United States. So Japan is very worrisome. The other piece which is very worrisome is South Korea. Right now, as we speak, South Korea has done 20 times the number of exercises that it did in recent previous years. Of course, some of this is related to COVID, but some of it is related to very, very deliberate escalation and the kind of hardware that is being used and tested currently on the Korean Peninsula speaks to the imminence and the granularity of preparation for war. The other thing to understand, and this is very, very key, is that South Korea, if you include reserve troops, has the world's largest military manpower. It's 3.5 million troops. These are highly skilled, highly trained, highly effective troops. It's the most, probably one of the most effective land armies on the planet. It already has almost 700,000 in current service, active duty, and another almost 3 million ready to serve. Now, the key thing to remember is that the United States has operational control over the South Korean military. South Korea has existed for 78 years. During those 78 years, there have been only 13 months during which South Korea controlled its own military. The rest of the time, the South Korean military has been under US OPCON or operational control. Now, the US will hedge and say, oops, you know, we only have wartime operational control. That's a red herring, because it's like saying, I only control the car when it's on the street. You control the car when it's in the garage. It doesn't make any difference. Armies are built for fighting, and if you control the army when it's fighting, then you have control over it. So essentially what the US has built for itself is a kind of military eminent domain, where at the drop of a hat, at the drop of a finger, at a snap of the fingers, it can take control of all of South Korea's troops, all of South Korea's military materiel, and all of South Korea's bases in preparation for war. And it is coordinating to the max with South Korea and with Japan and with the Philippines and with Australia and other countries in order to prepare for war. This is also why you can see the level of escalating belligerence against North Korea. And once again, let's be very clear. North Korea does not pose a threat to South Korea or to the United States. The North Korean military budget is $4 billion. That's less than the budget of the NYPD. So what it has essentially is a defensive deterrence capacity, which the US will not tolerate, but it has always used North Korea as a stalking horse to wage war and to contain China. The third aspect that I will mention is Taiwan. And once again, Taiwan is remilitarizing. It's being turned back into a de facto military base. Remember, until the mid-1970s, Taiwan was the United States' unsinkable aircraft carrier. It's the center of the first island chain, which encircles China with bases. It is about 100 miles away from the Chinese mainland. Prior to the opening of relations with China, the US used it as a fire base, a forward force projection platform to attack and harass and bomb China. And it has always served as a kind of center of anti-communist, fascist anti-communist organizing. For example, the death squad leader, Roberto d'Aubuisson, I don't know if people remember him. Roberto d'Aubuisson, who was the death squad leader of El Salvador, was trained. He was trained in counterinsurgency by the Taiwanese. So they were kind of the center of a counter-revolutionary movement in Asia and in the global South. Anyway, Taiwan is remilitarizing. The US has just passed the TERA, which is an amendment of the Taiwan Policy Act, which is essentially, to put it in its baldest terms, a declaration of war against China. It essentially gets rid of the one China policy, which is the foundation of relations between China and the United States. It creates provisions for not only massively militarizing Taiwan Island, but for also ensuring that US advisors are present. The US has openly stated that it is now sending troops to Taiwan. And of course, the US has snuck in troops in from time to time in the past, but it's a little bit like a relationship where, there's a kind of gray zone where, a relationship where certain things are tolerated. But once you state them in the open, that you state that you're cheating, then you know that you are headed for divorce. Okay, the gray zone is gone. The red line has been crossed. So that is, once again, extraordinarily escalatory. And we can see currently as we speak that Taiwan is being packed full of weapons, primarily missiles and long-range standoff weapons and asymmetrical weapons that are designed for very, very specific and concrete war fighting. The other element is, of course, and let me just say one more thing. Anytime that anytime that China has gone to war, Taiwan and Korea have come in coupled pairs. They came in a coupled pair in 1895. They came in a coupled pair in 1950. And I believe that it will come again as a coupled pair this time round as well. Taiwan, and then also we have to look at the Philippines. The Philippines has decided that it is adding 4 more bases to its already 5 US bases. So the US has 9 bases. These are very close to the South China Sea, which the US has planned out as the key choke point with which to strangle out China. This is where it will strangle and tap out China. And, once again, this is like, if we to use a psychotherapeutic metaphor, In domestic violence, anybody who's done a domestic violence knows that, couples can exchange harsh words. They may even hit each other. But once one of them starts to choke out, strangle, or prepare to strangle the partner, you know that you are in a completely different ball game. You have to assume that you are facing risk of death. Okay, so this is what the U.S. has prepared. It's prepared a choking strategy for China in the South China Sea. And all of these things, essentially what we're seeing is we're seeing timing, we're seeing specificity, we're seeing lethality, we're seeing planning, preparedness, intention, and declaration. All of these things speak to very, very dangerous situation right now. The last but not least, I think we also need to consider Australia. Australia has just jumped, not just, it has always been a US quisling, and everywhere the West has gone to war, Australia has been there. It went to war against Germany in German New Guinea. It was there in Gallipoli, it was there in Gaza, it was there in Indonesia. It fought in Vietnam, in Korea, in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Iraq again. The Australians have always been there. They're the first to know, the first to go and the last to know, but they have once again thrown in their lot with the United States. When Obama declared the Pacific Pivot, one of the first places where he placed new bases was in Darwin. And then more recently with the AUKUS agreement. The AUKUS agreement on the surface is an agreement to buy 3 to 5 Virginia-class nuclear submarines. The key questions to ask is, this will take 2 to 3 decades to complete. But the question is, why does Australia need nuclear submarines? Okay. And the only way to answer that is that essentially, if you acquire nuclear submarines, you're shifting your Navy from a defensive capacity, not that China is any threat to Australia, but you are shifting your Navy from a defensive capacity to an offensive capacity, in particular, a first strike strategic capacity, a nuclear strike, or a second strike, second nuclear strike, or you're going to travel far, far away and you're going to engage in aggressive attacks against Chinese naval forces. So all of this is to say that Australia, once again, has thrown its lot in as a member of the Five Eyes into war with the United States against China. So these are just a few of the movements, but I think you can notice both legislatively, politically, in terms of the information warfare, in terms of the geostrategic configurations, the military exercises, all of these things point to a very, very close and highly prepared strategy of war. And so I think it's very, very dangerous for all of us. I think we all need to get out our, I think we all need to put our shoulders to the wheel and think hard and work hard to prevent this, because if we don't, I think we'll be at war before we realize it. And I want to remind people who think that this can't happen. We've always thought that it can't happen until it does happen. One of the key architects of the Cold War was a theologian called Reinhold Niebuhr. And Reinhold Niebuhr is considered to have created the ethical architecture, the ethical grounding for the Cold War. In the 1950s, Mike Wallace asked him, if war were to break out, would you risk using nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union? And he hummed and hawed for a moment. And then he said, in the simplest sense, he said, we have to risk this. We have to risk nuclear war to prevent, the Reds from taking over. In other words, he said, better dead than red. So these are high stakes players. I believe that as the US loses its hegemony. And we clearly see this hegemony shifting with the BRICS, with China, with China, Russia, Iran, with the de-dollarization that is starting to happen, with the realignment of Saudi Arabia, which has always been a Western bulwark against pan-Arab socialism. Can you imagine your oldest Western proxy in the Middle East shifting its allegiance away? All of these things signal that there are huge movements afoot. And I believe that the ruling imperial class would rather see the end of the world than the end of their supremacy. And that's why this moment is so dangerous. And I will take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, KJ. Terrific presentation. What we're going to do now is just take a short break for announcements and fundraising. Jean, if you want to announce next week's program, go ahead and unmute yourself. I think Mehmet has to.
Yes, I am unmuted. And well, thanks so much, KJ. That was really a superlative discussion of this. And again, it's something we're very concerned with. But we have some good programs coming up. Next week, we all have heard about Silicon Valley Bank and its the problems with banking in the US. And fortunately, we have scheduled Professor Jack Rasmus to speak on the banking crisis. And Jack is a professor at St. Mary's University, and he's spoken before us before, so I think that'll be great. On April 8th, we're still working on what we are going to present. So, but be sure to come back next week for a discussion of the banking crisis. So back to you.
Okay, I just want to remind everybody that if you want to receive email notifications for our future programs, or you wish to view videos of our past programs going back over a decade, you can do that at our website at ICSSmarks.org. And you can also contact us through the contact form on the website. If you wish to make a donation to support our program, there is a link and information for you to make a donation on the website. So that's ICSSmarks.org. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have questions and comments and answers from participants. And what we'd like to do is have everybody raise your hand. If you look at the bottom of your screen on Zoom at the reactions button, you can raise your hand, ask questions, and we will take people generally in order the hands are raised. And we'd ask people to keep your questions and comments to a reasonable limit of 2 to 3 minutes. So why don't we start off? I'm just going to take people in order. We'll start with Sharon and then Keith. So Sharon, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, KJ, for a very sobering presentation. I just have a comment and then a question, a couple comments and then a question. So what you said about anti-Asian propaganda and violence is really important. And the propaganda against Asians and Asian Americans is escalating enormously. I point out an article in the New York Times Magazine of March 12th. It's entitled Spy Games. And the basic message is you can't trust, not only can you not trust overseas Chinese, you can't trust Chinese Americans either, because they all are targets of the Chinese government recruiting spies in this country. And taking that together with the TikTok nonsense that's going on, it's really scary. Mm-hmm. My question has to do with what do we think are the strategic goals of a war against China? So I would think that they want to get China out of the South China Sea. and more so, they would love to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party rule in China, but that can't happen without a land war, in my opinion, which would have enormous costs and absolutely raise the possibility of a nuclear war. So in between the limited operations in the South China Sea versus the broad land war, what do you think are the strategic goals?
Yeah, so let me answer that very briefly. A Rand Corporation wrote a document that was commissioned by the military called Thinking Through the Unthinkable War with China. It's actually a reference to the original Thinking About the Unthinkable, which was about nuclear war. And essentially what Rand says in that document it says that if we wage or if we initiate or if a shooting war happens in the South China Sea, $5.3 trillion worth of China's goods travel through the South China Sea. 70% of its oil travels through the South China Sea. So we don't have to win the war. Once we start shooting, or once the missiles start firing, all travel ceases through that area. China is effectively blockaded. We didn't blockade them, but it amounts to a de facto blockade. As a result of that, China will see somewhere between 25 to 30% of reduction in its economy. Its economy will essentially crash. And their strategic thinking is, China is a Potemkin state. It has no legitimacy, and it can only sustain itself, by handing out, candies and, constantly improving the standard of living. When it fails to do that, then it will fissure from internal contradictions. This has been, this is kind of a reinforced version of the collapsist argument that has existed since the 1990s. Hillary Clinton believed that China was going to collapse any minute. When the US allowed China to join the WTO, they believed that they would just exploit it, the hell out of it, until it collapsed, and that it was, essentially not different from the Soviet Union. It had so many deep internal contradictions that it was ready to, fracture and fission. And the imperialist strategy towards China has always been to fracture it. Remember, the 8-nation alliance was to split China into 8 portions of a pie that the imperialist nations would, divide amongst themselves. So I think there is that thinking going on. I think they're also hoping or expecting regime change. Again, that is unrealistic. The Chinese government is the most popular government on the planet right now, somewhere in the range of 92% support for the central government, as opposed to, the 20s, 30s, or sometimes even the low 10s for many Western governments. So all of this there's a kind of strategic blindness, a real miscalculation. But I believe that they believe that they have to take the risk. And I believe that some of this, the kind of the best and brightest of the ruling imperial elite believe that they can wage a war and win it. What's most striking is that the Pentagon had done 18 war games over Taiwan. And every time it did these war games, it was losing. It lost. It had its ass handed to it. And the more it did the war game, the faster it got its ass handed to it. Then recently, I think just perhaps a month ago, ICSS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, it's one of the deep state security think tanks that it has a revolving door with the State Department and the Pentagon. They recently released a war game in which they said, we can win. Taiwan can win. We can win war against China. It will be a Pyrrhic victory because they couldn't, completely lie about it. But they said it will be a very tough slog, but we can defeat China in a war over Taiwan. And they predicated this on 2 conditions. One is that Japan, we have to be able to use Japan for staging and fighting. And of course, Japan will participate. And the second piece is we have to make sure that the Taiwanese fight. Now, the people on Taiwan don't want to fight China. And the people in China don't want to fight the Taiwanese, who they consider to be their family. In fact, they literally are family. A large number of people on Taiwan Island literally have their ancestral homes in China. They speak Chinese, they eat Chinese, they are Chinese. But the US wants them to fight. And in order to ensure that, in the terror at the TPA, and in many other documents, the US has said, and in the ICSS war game document, they said, we have to make sure the Taiwanese fight. That is to say, they have to be the Ukrainians of the Far East in our proxy war. And so just very recently, another very ominous sign against all popular will, the Taiwanese government, the DPP, has increased the time of conscription by threefold. Okay, so they're keeping their conscripts in the military for a full year now. Before it was simply 4 months. So once again, these are qualitative shifts that speak to the level of preparation and determination for war.
Okay, next is Keith, followed by Janet, followed by Richard. So Keith, please go ahead and.
Okay, well, first, thank you for the presentation. I'd like to know how you think the Russians will respond if we would go to war with China. China has backstopped Russia as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned by buying all their oil. Wouldn't Russia simply sell them even more oil and gas if they get cut off from, say, Saudi Arabia because of an effective blockade? And what kind of help, military help, could they expect from Russia? Russia is not going to forget the help that they got from China in the current war.
Yeah, Keith, I think this is a really, really good question. And to be quite honest, I don't have the full answer. It's hard to predict these kinds of things. I think there are many variables, many factors that enter into that are very, very granular and specific to whether a country decides to go to war or not. Now, technically, Russia and China have very, very good relations. They've said that these are the best relations that they ever had in the history of the two countries. I believe that is absolutely true. You saw that between the Xi-Putin meeting. They spent, 4.5 hours together, and then Putin personally ushered Xi out to his limousine. And so you can see there's a level of camaraderie, solidarity, cooperation, I think, which they characterize as, which goes beyond that of any ally. At the same time, you have to note that they have declared that they are not an alliance. That is to say, they are not a military alliance. And that has to do with what China is trying to do right now. China and Russia and the other BRICS countries are trying to build out essentially a multipolar world, a pluripolar world, which is based on a multilateral order. That is to say, a multilateral order where states are equal with each other, but that they're not aligned or blocked or ganging up on each other. This is the ideal that China is trying to build out. I've analogized it to kind of like an idealized family, where families don't have alliances, but where the entire community is family to each other, and in so doing, you can build out a different conception of a human being and their relations with each other. It's, in the most ideal form, it's, kind of like what the early socialist kibbutz tried to do. But so they're trying to create a system which does not have alliances, preferences, blocks. And so because of that, they're putting forth this global security alliance, global security initiative, which is about mutuality, it's about mutuality and sustainability of security. So remember, the Western model of international relations is realism. Under realism, there is no such thing as a global order. You only have individual states seeking to maximize their self-interest in competition with each other. In other words, the global order is simply a reflection of the individualistic capitalist order expanded onto an international stage. And inside this situation, essentially, nobody can really be sure of the intentions of the other party. And therefore, you have to hedge, and you have to watch out for your own interests. And eventually, you have to hedge to the extent that you have to control the other. So this is what we call the security dilemma, because of the epistemic blindness, because you can never know what other minds are thinking or what other states are intending. You have to build up your military capacity and be ready for war. And ultimately, depending on your version of realism, you have to dominate. So the lack of knowledge leads to domination and control. Essentially, we're looking at a recipe for war. The Chinese are trying to break away from this. And so what they're putting forth is, in the Global Security Initiative, it's a kind of a rehashing of the non-aligned movement, the principles of the non-aligned movement as elucidated by, Zhou Enlai, combined with some of the elements of the UN Charter that guarantee security and territorial integrity and equality, etc. Put those two together, and what you get is the Global Security Initiative. It's a start, and it's a good start. And philosophically, it's a break with the existing tenets of realism, because what it does is it brings a kind of intersubjectivity into international relations that was missing from before. In other words, we are going from Hobbes to Habermas. Okay, we're trying to build in some kind of Marxist notion of communality and intersubjectivity into international relations, which we build on a kind of discourse ethic and dialogue that allows us to move towards a more stable and peaceful order. I think that is powerful and meaningful, but of course, the US doesn't want it. The US is so deeply tied into its notion of hegemony. It's so deeply tied into this individualistic and epistemically blind notion of domination. That's the only model that it knows. And that model is built on the extractivism and the rentier financialization of the global North, that it lives and breathes on its rentier extraction from the global South. We can, those of us who do this, we know what the figures are. Since 1960, $152 trillion worth of value extracted from the global South, right? From China alone, $4 trillion worth of value extracted from China alone towards, the global North. That's why, when people talk about China being a country, that, that doesn't make sense, because purely in terms of this kind of, asymmetry of flow of extraction, China is peripheral, or at least semi-peripheral. It is not a core country. And so understanding this nature and understanding the US, kind of attachment to having the global order maintained in its current state, and understanding the function of the global reserve currency, that, remember, the dollar is built on the basis of oil as a commodity. And because of that, as the world de-dollarizes, the US essentially has its unlimited credit card taken away from it, right? The rest of the world, it sells the US goods. The US doesn't have to sell things back to these countries, exchange things back. All it does is it prints money. It prints T-bills, gives it to these countries. These countries then end up with an IOU. They buy US credit in exchange for, the goods of their own labor. And these IOUs build up, but the US constantly gets to print this until the present moment that we see now, that as the US tries to decouple from China, essentially destroying the global supply chain, and as it sanctions Russia through its financial, weaponizing, it has essentially created the conditions to destroy its own financial hegemony as the global reserve currency and its exorbitant privilege. So once again, the contradictions are rife, but this is how, the ruling elite think. Or that is to say, they don't think. They only think in terms of the short-term tactical interest rather than the long-term strategic interest. So this is a very long-winded answer, but how will Russia support China if they go to war? It is unknown. We'll see what happens. Certainly, Russia has tremendous capacity in terms of weapon system. It also has tremendous capacity in terms of, commodities and raw goods. So any kind of economic sanctions will bounce off China's back. They share a border, and so that cannot be cut short by the naval control, which is how the Western imperial nations have always held power. They control the seas. This is why we say rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves, right? The Western colonial powers have always been naval powers. And what we see in this China, Russia, Iran, BRICS configuration is the arising of a different type of global agglomeration based on land power. Land power, for the first time in 500 years, has the capacity to defeat sea power. And so I think financially, logistically, in terms of trade, economics, Russia will support. Will it fight? I don't know, but I think that still remains to be seen. Remember, the war between Russia and the United States through the proxy of Ukraine is still ongoing. We don't know where that will land yet.
Okay, next is Janet, followed by Richard Wright and Jean. So Janet, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Your presentation is wonderful. The decoupling you're talking about, it's connected to the multipolarity concept. I believe that, or I understand that Russia and China have been doing joint exercises in the Pacific. But then, of course, there is the attempted broadening of NATO's purview into the Pacific Ocean. So that's it. I have a few questions. One is, you referred to CSIS. Could you put what that stands for into the chat when you get a chance? So Scott Ritter has said that China would demolish any U.S. naval attack on Taiwan. Would you talk about China's military size and preparedness? And then also, what do you think the U.S. justification for war against China will be? Or if it comes to China militarily preventing Taiwan from becoming independent, might that be the pretext?
Yes, these are all really, really great questions. I put into the chat, CSIS is the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I think it was founded by Kissinger in the 1960s, and it is one of the central national security state think tanks. And remember, think tanks function kind of like a shadow or parallel government for the United States. On the surface, you have elections and faces change and parties change, but at the core, you have these think tanks that are integral part of what we would call, for lack of a better term, part of the deep state, and they ensure the continuity of policy across administrations. And so CSIS, which is also related, there's a kind of an annex of CSIS called CNAS, Center for a New American Security. Center for a New American Security. Does that remind you of anything? It should. It should remind you of the Project for a New American Century. It has at least two similar words. It's practically a rhyming cognate.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I don't see CSIS in the chat. Maybe you have to press enter or something.
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have sent it to everybody, but for some reason I sent it to Raj. So
Thank
Raj.
you.
Okay, there you go. Yes, Center for Strategic International Studies. So CNAS came out of CSIS, and CSIS is generally, it's a war hawk think tank, which is generally about US supremacy. CNAS was the think tank that developed the United States strategy on Afghanistan, which is known as COIN, or counterinsurgency. And they believe that COIN was a form of armed social work. That is to say, you play Jekyll and Hyde with the people that you're oppressing. During the day, you give them soccer balls and vaccinations, and at night you burst into their houses and drag them out, similar to what, for example, the Israelis do, or any, kind of occupying force does. So they created this doctrine of COIN, and COIN is still very, very much active in the minds of military and strategic thinkers. So you see this constantly in foreign policy, where the US is playing Jekyll and Hyde with the Chinese. One day they're good, it's Dr. Jekyll, and the next day it's Mr. Hyde, usually right before meetings. Before meetings, they'll pull some kind of Hyde, monstrosity, and then during the meeting they'll make nice, and then right after they'll do something again escalatory. So we see this constant oscillating, but you cannot pick and choose. You have to see the totality than one single aspect of it. And so going back to your points and your question, you mentioned that China and Russia are doing naval exercises. They are indeed, and Iran is joining them. And so there's a kind of intensification of exercises between the counter-hegemonic bloc as well. But you're absolutely correct. NATO is now currently expanding into Asia. And so South Korea is part of the NATO security alliance. They do information sharing with NATO. The Luftwaffe and Australia and a whole bunch of NATO countries have been exercising. And for example, the Germans have been training for long-range bombing and long-range jet attacks into the Pacific. So that requires jet tanker refueling, etc. They've been doing these things that are quite extraordinary. It's just unheard of. But all of this is just, as I said, granular, specific, detailed preparation for war. So what would be the casus belli? What would be the justification for war? I think there are a whole bunch of them. In the most general sense, what you see the US preparing right now is just general demonization. And as you go into war, you look for two types of messaging. One is, this country is an imminent threat to you. So that's the WMD, right? If you don't get them now, the mushroom cloud, you could see the mushroom cloud. So that's the imminent existential threat. And you see this constantly being churned out in different ways. So, for example, China is responsible for COVID. Already 66% of the US population believes that China was responsible for COVID, and that it was a COVID leak. And 44% believe that it was deliberate on the part of China. Can you imagine that, you deliberately leak it out onto your own population? So there's a real disconnect, and nobody asks the foundational question, if this was a Chinese bioweapon, why was the US funding it? That's the $20,000 question nobody wants to touch, because if it was being funded, the US doesn't fund anything that China does. It doesn't even let Chinese scientists study meteorology or hydrology or cancer. Why would it fund Chinese studies into some kind of bioweapon? So there's just a kind of a complete detachment from reality in certain people's thinking. There is, anyway, I won't go too far into that. But anyway, what you want in terms of casus belli is existential threat. So existential threat is, on the one hand, you want terror, and on the other hand, you want pity, like Aristotle, Aristotle said, terror and pity. So you have the terror of an existential threat. It could be that they're, surveilling you, spying on you with TikTok, your refrigerator, the bridge on the Bay, the Bay Bridge was built by a Chinese company. I think it's called ZPMC. And they're saying that this country, which also builds the cranes, is spying on you. Those cranes are spying on the United States. They're surveilling you. And I wouldn't be surprised if they take down the Bay Bridge very soon. You know, the Chinese were the only people who could build it in time and to budget. But now that the bridge is spying on us, we should probably take it down. So surveillance, you know, balloons become a threat. It's this kind of paranoid ideation where everything is a threat, right? And then on the other hand, you also have the allegations of human rights violations. So that's the other part, the R2P, the humanitarian intervention. And so we've been hearing for years now, first Tibetan genocide, strange genocide, no bodies. Now the Uyghur genocide, strange genocide. The population has increased 3.3-fold. Life expectancy has doubled, and they were exempted from the one-child policy, but it's still some kind of genocide, right? Yeah, even if they get to speak their own language, exercise their own religion, it must be some kind of genocide. So we're using the genocide label, which is so extraordinary and so preposterous, but they're trying to use what is called Pascal's wager. When you say something which is so absurd, but the risks of not believing are so extreme, then most people will choose to believe, even if it sounds absurd, because the risk of not believing, the stakes of not believing are so high that you just kind of have to nod your head and go along with it. And so, human rights allegations, genocide allegations, existential biological threat, and then all the other stuff. You throw in all the other tropes, they're taking away our jobs, they're destroying our economy, everything and anything, they are a threat. It's Reds under the bed. The specific mechanism is not very clear, but one of the things that can be suggested is you can read a book called Strategy of Denial by Elbridge Colby, who was the author of the 2018 National Defense Strategy. He's the son of the other Colby who was in the CIA. What's his name? Anyway, it's a family tradition. But anyway, Elbridge Colby says in the Strategy of Denial, he says that the US has to exercise a binding strategy, wrong for China, make it fire the first shot, as Abraham Lincoln did it at Fort Sumter. Make China fire the first shot, and then rally all US allies, much as the US tried to do against Russia, into a binding strategy where they will wage war and will use as many proxies as possible because the US is low on military manpower. It could be, for example, they continue to stuff Taiwan Island full of weapons. And at a certain point, China may decide to interdict some of these shipments. It's a little bit like, Taiwan is part of China. It is like your family. Janet, imagine that you have a family member in your house. They lock themselves in their room, and then they start filling their room with weapons, with guns. Okay, how long would you tolerate that? Would you tolerate it? Would you just close your eye to it? Or would you decide at a certain point that you have to take those weapons away? Okay, if that happens, that could be a casus belli. And so generally, breaking a blockade followed by the breaking of a blockade, that could be a casus belli. I can imagine any of a number of, minor border incidents, minor, kind of air skirmishes that could be escalated into a war. Remember, the balloon, a weather balloon, and there are 53,000 weather balloons launched every year. A weather balloon with no directional control was considered to be an imminent threat. And I was hearing in the first hours that it was traveling over the United States, that it was a potential nuclear threat, that it was that it was an AMP, it was a nuclear AMP weapon that has drifted over that had been sent over the United States. I was hearing this from people who know very well the U.S. Strategic posture, who are experts in it. And so if that's the level of thinking that's going along for even, clear thinking people, you can imagine what they're thinking or drafting up at the State Department and at the Pentagon. And just one more thing, when you have a balloon traveling at 60,000 feet, the kind of area that it surveils, or the horizon that it covers, is about twice the width of, I think it was Idaho. And so, of course, you could say that it was surveilling. Simply by the virtue of its height, it is going to cover a very large swath of territory. So to say it was overflying or surveilling, specific nuclear installation is absurd on the face. But as I said, we're hearing nonstop absurdities. And the more absurd these lies are, the closer we are to war.
And then what about the capacity of China's military?
Okay, so China's military capacity is a defensive capacity. And the US calls this defensive capacity, it refers to it as A2AD, anti-access area denial. But that is just a euphemism for defensive. But it's a little bit inconvenient if they, say to, Congress, we need more money to defeat China's defensive capacity, because that means you're going on the offensive, right? Or if you put it out in the news that, China's defensive capacity is a threat to us, that doesn't make any sense. So they replace that defensive capacity with the term A2AD, which makes it sound more jargony and more belligerent. So China has, land fighting capacities. Traditionally it was an army. It was a land-based army. That's why it calls itself the PLA. And even the Navy and the Air Force still have the word army in them, right? It's the People's Liberation Army Navy, People's Liberation Army Air Force. But they have, their forces. I think they're working on integration and joint operations, which they have not been good at in the past, because they haven't gone to war for 44 years. The last time they were in any real kinetic war with a foreign power was with Vietnam in 1979. And that was because Vietnam had invaded Cambodia, which was a Chinese ally. And Vietnam actually went on to colonize Cambodia for about 10 years until it decided that it wasn't worth, the pain. But anyway, China has not gone to war for 44 years. And so there's a question. The US thinks that, China is not capable of war because it doesn't have the kind of fighting fitness that the US has had for a very, very long time, that hasn't been continuing waging war like the United States. It suspects that China does not have the capacity to do the kind of joint operations, the joint maneuvers that the US is very skilled at. And of course, the US is still the most powerful military on the planet. Regardless of how you slice it and dice it, it still is the most powerful. It's the one area where the US still maintains its hegemony, is in military power. And then the second area is in lawfare or legal warfare, because it's a government run by lawyers. And the third dimension of its power is in PR, advertising, information warfare, because it's so skilled at, advertising and, propaganda. So these are the three areas of strength. But China's military capacity is a defensive capacity. If the US takes the war to China, it probably has a more than adequate capacity to defend itself. Now, remember, US, declarative strategic posture is to use nuclear weapons if it feels that its strategic goals or strategic assets are threatened. Okay. So what I'm saying here is that war with China could go nuclear very, very rapidly. China has a very large missile defense force. It's actually a separate branch of their military, and they have, created a lot of what are called carrier killer missiles, long range, medium range missiles that are, and hypersonic missiles that are designed to take out US aggression on the high seas before it becomes a real threat to China. And these are the Dongfeng 21, the Dongfeng 26, and possibly other, missile capacities. The US counterbalance, and let's kind of go back into the Cold War terminology. If you think back to the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union traditionally had overmatch against the West in conventional forces. And in order to counterbalance this overmatch of the Soviet Union, the United States built out what was called the first offset. And the first offset was essentially the plan to use nuclear weapons. The first offset is mass. It's a bigger bomb. We have a bigger bomb. We can defeat you, even though your armies are bigger. Okay. The counterbalance, and this is always what happens in strategic military affairs, is the Russians built their own bomb. And so then the Russians also have the bomb, and the US was looking for the second offset. The second offset is precision. That is to say, you have precision missiles that can knock out these weapons before they are launched. And this is the entire generation of, smart missiles, cruise missiles, etc. And these form the basis of what we call air-land battle, which was the US battle doctrine against the USSR until it fell. Air-land battle was never used against the USSR, but it was used in the Iraq War and in all subsequent US wars since. The second offset, which is precision, precision defeats mass. But the question is, what defeats precision? Okay, and the answer to that is the third offset. The third offset is diffusion or dispersion, that it's swarming. So when you attack in a swarming, distributed fashion, which is so far and so wide, and the theater of war is so expanded that there are not enough precision weapons to take out these swarming attacks. This is what the US is preparing for China right now, and it's what's called air-sea battle and different variations of it. So it involves island hopping, it involves stacking missiles all along the first island chain like dragon's teeth. It involves pulling in all its allies, South Korea, Japan, Okinawa, Taiwan, Australia, soon to be New Zealand, possibly Thailand, Germany and NATO, anything and everybody. It's pulling them into the battle, expanding the theater of war, making it so diffuse and wide that China cannot defend against it. And of course, the other dimension of the third offset is subsurface warfare. You're increasing the dimensions of warfare. You're coming in stealthily under the water, or you're attacking through long-range attacks, long-range standoff missiles, etc. So and of course, there's the whole weaponization of space and cyber warfare. So there's a huge panoply of attacks that are being prepared, what is China's counter? I would say that China's counter largely has been asymmetrical in that it is building out its diplomatic relations with the rest of the world, that it hasn't tried to go tit for tat with the United States in terms of its military buildup. It knows that over the long term, it will win because it has a stronger economy. It has a real economy, not a financialized economy. And it knows that if it continues to build out relations, then it becomes like the game of Go, where you connect to live. In Go, you connect in order to live. The US is playing a tactical game of chess. You occupy and you capture in order to kill. Very, very different mindset, very, very different perspective. So I know that doesn't quite answer your question, Janet. And some of that is because, there's a level of classification that I'm not privy to. But certainly, China is preparing for war as well. I was in China several years ago, and I spoke to somebody, and they said, I work at a hospital, at a military hospital, and we have been told to prepare for mass casualties.
Thank you.
Okay. What I'd like to do is try and get everybody's questions in. We have limited time. So I'd ask everybody to please limit it to one question per participant. So let's go to Richard, Jean, Raj, and then Leo. So Richard, please go ahead.
Thank you. I actually had two questions, sort of. One is I wanted to point out that Michael Clare has recently published an article regarding the Chinese addressing of the Taiwan situation, in which he says that basically China will wait out the U.S. military buildup, which he thinks is a waste of taxpayer money. And I was wondering if you could maybe comment on that. I mean, but the other question I had is you basically focused on the east side of things. What can you talk? Can you talk a little bit about the western side of things? In other words, India and in particular Pakistan, who just wait. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, those are really good questions. Very, very briefly, Michael Clare is somebody I distrust intensely. I believe that he is kind of a sheepdogging, Democrat whose main job is to deceive progressives and make them think that he's in favor of peace when actually he's shilling for the war machine and the State Department. So I would be very, very careful about Clare. But in this case, I think I have read the article, and I think he's right in that China doesn't want war. China doesn't want war. And so China will avoid war if it can. As for the fact of weapons being a waste of taxpayer money, well, they're always a waste of taxpayer money, right? I mean, that's kind of, a given. And so I think that goes without saying. But in that rare occasion, in that very, very rare occasion, I think Clare has some credibility. Most of the time, I take an entire salt lick when I read a Clare article. And I know that it will take me, several days to unwind from all the, misrepresentations and lies that he throws out routinely without, the minimum, kind of circumspection or care. I mean, he can't even pronounce the word phonop properly. And so, that's, he always calls them phronops. That tells you, how tuned in he is. But regarding the Western aspect, okay, so there are a couple of complex factors here. And once again, this is a complex buildup. Originally, India was supposed to be part of the Quad, and the Quad was supposed to function as an Asian NATO. Now, if you remember, the Quad was originally proposed by Japan, and it was to be an alliance of Japan, Australia, the United States, and India, right? Kevin Rudd, who was the Prime Minister of Australia, was deposed by Julia Gillard. I think there's very good evidence that shows that he was overthrown because he would not get in line with the Quad, and he refused to join an anti-China coalition. Now that he's out of power, now he's quite happy to attack China. And he is referred to them as, I think even when he was in power, he referred to the Chinese leadership as rat fuckers. Okay, so that tells us where we are. That wasn't strong enough for them. They had to get rid of him and get in a complete stooge like Julia Gillard. But so India is a key part of this equation. And originally the plan was to use India as a bulwark against China along the Western flank. We heard very, very recently that the US had been supplying intelligence to India around border skirmishes, right? You saw that the US was directly supplying intelligence to India to favor it or to, support it during the kind of border skirmishes. Luckily, those border skirmishes, they have resulted in deaths, but they have not resulted in the firing of arms. So there's still some fire discipline going on the part of both. When the US built out its Indo-Pacific strategy, remember we used to call it the Asia-Pacific, and we used to call it the Asia-Pacific Command. Now it's the Indo-Pacific Command. So this was how important India was to the US plan for, war against China. India was a key part of it, but India has fallen away. And we know why, right? Because of the war in Ukraine, because the US had tried to press gang India into sanctioning Russia. And of course, that's not going to work because as traditionally part of the non-aligned movement, Russia was a strong supporter of India, supported at every crisis and every juncture at the UN. So this history and this established relationship matters. And so India has a little bit fallen into a gray zone. Originally, it would have been a key ally and a key, force projection platform. It would be the left side flank against China, but that's fallen away a little bit too. And then Pakistan is also, a complex situation because traditionally it has always been a close ally of China. Remember when Kissinger went to China to meet with Zhou Enlai? There were no flights going into China. There were no relations. He flew to Pakistan. And from Pakistan, he took a plane to China because China had good relations with Pakistan, one of its closest allies. But once again, Pakistan has undergone a coup. There's some question marks at the current moment, what is going on, how it will ally, and, what are the forces impinging on it. So there are some question marks that I can't fully answer. But all I can say is if we look out over the long term, if Iran and Saudi Arabia, sworn enemies, can find a way to mediate their relationships through the auspices of China. And if Saudi Arabia, which since 1915, since Lawrence of Arabia, has been a Western proxy, a counter-revolutionary force against pan-Arab socialism, if Saudi Arabia can shift its sides, then that tells us there's some deep and profound changes happening in the world right now. And I would expect that India and Pakistan also fall under those lines. I would not be surprised eventually if there's some, rapprochement between India and Pakistan, and perhaps through the auspices of Russia between India and China as well. All things point in that direction, in particular in the movement towards a basket of currencies that accelerates de-dollarization. Currently, we're talking about the 5 R's or possibly the 7 R's. The 5 R's, instead of the dollar, are the Brazilian real, the Russian rupee, the Russian ruble, the Indian rupee, the Chinese renminbi or the yuan, the South African rand, and add to that the Saudi Arabian rial and the Iranian rial. So if these countries create a basket of currencies, then that will do considerable, that will have considerable impact on the exorbitant privilege of the dollar.
Okay, we have about 50 minutes left. I want to ask everybody, please limit to one question. So let's start with Jean, followed by Raj, followed by Leo. So Jean.
Okay, well, thanks so much, KJ. I just really enjoy your talk so much. But I just want to say, as you know, my son married a Chinese woman from Taiwan, and so I feel a special kinship with that, and would also note that Taiwan, again, even the United States, nobody recognizes Taiwan as a country. It is part of China. United States recognizes that officially, even though our Slippery Joe slips up on that occasionally when his comments, but I really appreciate that. But the other thing I wanted to say, and I appreciate your comments on that, is China is just not another Western power on the Western model. It is always been this middle kingdom. It is the unifier. It has a different vision of the world. And I think it's been a peacemaker. I mean, it's going to making peace in the Middle East, how they bring these traditional enemies together and so forth. And there's a whole different model, whole different mindset that China has, which, I think it's very important that we try to understand that. And I appreciate your comments on that so much. And if you care to elaborate, I'm all ears, but I know there are other things you need to talk about.
Well, I think those are very important points. The first point that I'll make is that the people on Taiwan Island are Chinese. There are some indigenous people that predate the migrations of the Ming Dynasty, the Qing Dynasty, or the ROC. but we also know that they probably came from China, or at least the region that became China, that is to say south of the Yalu River. And so if you note, the Ma Jingyu, who was the former president of Taiwan, is visiting China. And he says that he's visiting China to visit his ancestral graves. Once again, he's highlighting his connection, his ancestral connection with China, which goes against the current doctrine and ideology and propaganda, which is being put out by the ruling DPP party and the West, which says that Taiwan is an indigenous and free and, independent state. That's absolutely not the case. It is a Chinese province, and the Republic of China, the Taiwanese constitution itself asserts that. It says that our constitution says that we are part of China, which includes this island and the mainland. And so by all legal and all international and by all cultural standards, Taiwan province is a part of China. It's just the US which is trying to create this legal fiction, which it then wants to weaponize as a trigger to provoke war. I think that it's important to remember that at one point China had the largest navy on the planet. This was Zheng He. He was actually a Muslim who was China's greatest admiral. And he had a massive fleet of 300 ships, and they traveled all over the planet, including to Africa. And they never took one slave, and they never invaded a single country. They were all about building relations and diplomacy. That's all they did. I think they may have brought a giraffe back for the emperor because they were so intrigued by it. But they took silk, they traded, they came back, and they never took, this notion of expansionist colonization, of settler colonialism, is diametrically opposed to the Chinese worldview and philosophy. Now, people say, well, what about Xinjiang? What about Tibet? Blah, blah, blah. Okay, first thing to note is that there is a kind of natural border that China has. And once it reaches those borders, it simply stays in there. The empire tends to fracture, and then it tends to reunite. And these moments of reunification, people claim, well, that's imperialism. No, it's not. It's very, very different. I'm not going to, litigate, the definitions of imperialism, but essentially it's very, very different. But I think an important person to read is perhaps François Julien. He's a French philosopher, Julien, and he has written some very complex but rich texts about China from a Western perspective. He's a classicist, so if you're a Western thinker, this gives you a kind of an entree into Chinese thinking, which you can't dismiss as simply, Chinese propaganda. But essentially, he says, the Chinese, in its simplest terms, the Chinese philosophy to the world is to trade and to connect and to relate and to live and let live. There can be win-win cooperation. They don't want war. They don't need war. If you travel to any Chinese capital, you will be struck by how much there is in their culture an aspiration for peace. The streets are named after peace. The buildings are named after peace. The pavilions are named after peace. It's this deep aspiration in Chinese culture for peace because they've known war and they know that it's pointless and meaningless. And certainly imperial war, colonial war, war of conquest, that's not part of their, approach to the world. So I think Julien is important. I think it ties back into this Taoist notion of Wu Wei, doing nothing, non-contention, non-action, non-aggression. I think that is very deep inside Chinese culture.
Thank you.
Okay, next is Raj, followed by Leo, Kit, and Youssef. And I think we're going to have to cut it. Let's try to make it within our time boundaries. So Raj, please go ahead.
Hey, KJ, thanks for your presentation and all the explanations that you've given. But we're Marxists here, Marxist library. So I want to bring Marx and Lenin a little bit into our thing. And then the third person I'll bring in is very different, is Dugin. So it seems, and I agree with you, we are at a flipping point in the war. The American hegemony is being challenged and is going to end sooner or later. Whether the world ends before that, that's the question you are worried about, and we're all worried about it. But we don't think it'll happen by intentions. It could happen accidentally because, as Putin has said, no one will survive. So that, I think that's why it won't happen for that reason. But short of it, I agree with you, American imperialism will try to dominate. Now, it's very interesting using the term Dugin was using. It's like land-based power versus sea-based power. That's a Dugin. I wonder if you've read him. And where Marx and Lenin come in is that the fact the country has been peaceful in the past doesn't basically say that what you will do in the future. I mean, Jewish people were oppressed, peaceful people, okay? And then Jews, under Israel, they become very aggressive. So there's a dynamic of capitalism itself that comes into play that I think is not in your description. I don't disagree with you that there is a great danger. The United States is an imperialist power trying to push. But I think Ukraine war has upset their calculation already. And China and Russia have come together. And on India, I wanted to tell you that what Modi is doing, Modi is a right of center politician. I just dislike him. He's not from my side of but Nehru is following Nehruvian foreign policy, which is based on balancing great powers and try to stay out of getting into wars. That's what India is doing. And India-China relationships actually have improved because Xi Jinping now realizes that it is not a good idea to have
2
this
minutes.
tension. So I think that India, but Pakistan remains a question mark. Yeah, I'm going to finish it. Pakistan remains a question mark. Pakistan is sending tanks to Ukraine, and trying to please Uncle Sam. So Pakistan is a problematic state. But anyway, you can comment on any of that. But particularly, I'd like to know whether you've read Dugin and what you think of it.
Raj, I haven't read Dugin, but Dugin's formulation, as you describe it, comes out of Halford Mackinder, who was the original geostrategic thinker. And he was the person who spoke about, the creation of central landmass that became the pivot state of the world, and that this would coagulate and become the center of world power. And then this was translated down into multiple generations, including Brzezinski. So Dugin is not unusual, and he's not unique in any of this. I think what you're taking exception to is that I'm giving a geopolitical and a geostrategic analysis than a Marxist analysis. I can do that too if you want. I think that we don't have enough time, but we can understand it also from a Marxist perspective away. The two are not necessarily different. They're not opposed to each other. We can, both and these analyses. The other thing that I'm sensing, is the argument that you're making is that China is capitalist, and as a capitalist state, it will have the same capitalist tendencies. Okay, we've had this argument on and off for a long time, and I disagree with you. And I'll disagree with you in the simplest sense in this way. Raj, you are a Marxist, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and what work do you do?
I'm a retired guy now.
Yes, and what did you do before you retired?
I was a structural engineer.
You're a structural engineer. Was your firm a capitalist firm?
No, it was a petty bourgeois.
It was a petty bourgeois firm, but it was embedded in the capitalist order, right?
Of course it was, yeah.
And so you were engaged in a capitalist organization embedded in the capitalist order, correct?
Yeah, of course.
So does that make you a capitalist?
No, I was a petty bourgeois. But
Okay,
the firm was
you're
petty bourgeois. I
slicing.
was not petty bourgeois, but the firm operated as petty bourgeois business. Okay,
Okay.
petty
And
capitalism.
and Raj, you live in a neighborhood, correct?
I do.
And what is that neighborhood?
North Berkeley,
Okay, and what is the average cost of a house in that neighborhood?
over $1 million.
Yeah,
for
so I'd
sure.
say probably close to 1.5, 2 million, right?
Yeah, something like
Okay.
that.
So that might make you a millionaire, right?
No, because I owe money still to the bank. So I'm
Okay, but you have assets. You have
yeah,
significant assets, right?
I mean, yeah, but you're going
So you
into
see where I'm
personal
going,
stuff.
Raj, right? You see, the
Listen,
same
look,
arguments that you make against China not being capitalist,
look, if
so
you
be
want a long
leveled against
discussion
you.
on this,
Mhm.
I can have it. This is not a personal discussion between.
Oh, no,
you-
but you
But-
don't get to exclude yourself, right? This is the nature of our reasoning, is you don't get to make exceptions for yourself.
No,
Let me try to,
individual-
let's try to get one more question in.
Yeah.
And also what I'd like to do is have KJ, if some people have requested, if you agree, to put your email address in the chat for people to contact you. It's up to you, of course.
Yes,
It's
okay,
privacy issues.
yeah, I can do that.
I think it'd be good
the
for
key
us to
point
have
that
a
I want
future
to make
program.
is
Yeah,
that
go ahead, go ahead.
there is China, if China had shifted back to capitalism, it has elements of a market economy in it. But if China had shifted back to capitalism, you would see the manifestations that you always see in counter-revolutionary movements, which is what you saw with the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union became capitalist, you saw all those phenomena, and we know them well, right? The destruction of, the public sector, the loss of life expectancy. All of these things are expected and predictable things that you can see when a country shifts into capitalism or shifts back into capitalism. You saw none of those things in China. In fact, what you saw was a consistent improving of the lifting up of people. And it is not a socialist state yet. It is a proto-socialist state, but it is on the path. And I think it's very anti-dialectical to think that things are just one thing or another, or that they don't involve some kind of process, which itself entails contradictions within itself, but that resolves itself towards a higher goal. I think that's all I'll say for now. It's a very complex argument, but I think that, Raj, both on a personal level and a political level,
personal level, which I object to.
I don't think you have a leg to stand on.
I don't think it's
All right.
appropriate.
So let's move ahead. Go ahead. This will be the last
I
question.
disagree with. Okay,
12:30.
and I don't have equal chance to answer you. Okay, because
we can do we'll do a future program. Leo, could you ask your question, please? Unmute.
Yes, am I on?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, I wonder why this current provocations in the China Sea not seen as a continuation of the Obama-Biden policies toward China, in Ukraine, and in Syria, that have all resumed at the same time under Biden. And it's also a sign of why the deep state has such rapid reaction against Trump's approach to Russia and North Korea. And nothing has been said here about that.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I fully understood. What I can say is that the Biden policy is simply a continuation of the Obama policy, which is a continuation of the Bush doctrine, which is a continuation of the 1992 Defense Planning Guidance document, which was for US hegemony. Even back in the 1990s, the US clearly saw China on the horizon, and then this was prepared for the US got distracted, or it was part of a larger, global agenda, but it is fighting multiple wars, and it sees this control over the Eurasian continent as part of this continued plan. Remember, Brzezinski said that what you have to do is you have to separate China and Russia. You can't allow them to get together. If you do, you've essentially lost the game. Well, this is what the Biden administration is doing. But this is a kind of continuous progress. There's clear continuity, both in the players, but in the doctrine and the policies. As I said, goes back to 1992. I know those of you who are not geostrategic thinkers, you want to take it back further, you can. You can take it back as far back as the revolution or even further back, but it all aligns. Where does Ukraine and Syria fit into this? I think, there's a question amongst the neocons. The neocons have been trying to figure out the ultimate goal, and let's be very clear about this, the ultimate goal is China. The goal is to take down China. And during the Iraq War, the hawks would say, little boys go to Iraq, real men go to Iran. They wanted to go after Iran, okay? And even now there are people saying, Russia is just, secondary, small fry. We have to reorient to fight with China. And there is a group of people that is doing that. Eli Ratner was screaming that at the top of his lungs for about a year now. But the US is trying to figure out how to move forward. It's gotten itself into a little bit of a tar pit in Ukraine. And the question it's asking itself is, do we finish off Russia first and then pivot to China? Or do we abandon attacking Russia, finishing off Russia, and pivot directly to China? Or do we have an ambidextrous strategy that we wage a two-front war with two nuclear powers? Okay, I think there's some ambiguity, and I think they're constantly shifting and debating amongst themselves. Syria is a smaller subset of this larger set of conflicts. I hate to say that, but it ties in with undermining Russia and also undermining just general resistance to US hegemony in the Middle East in general. And so inside that context, what is happening and what is happening next? I think that the ruling elite is trying to figure that out. I think there's some unknowns. I think there's some ideological blindness. I think they both overestimated and underestimated, and then overestimated and underestimated several times the situation with Russia. I think they're not quite clear whether they should have a two-pronged strategy, a single strategy. There's some uncertainty there. And so I think that those elements are being worked out right now as we speak. But what I do know is Eli Ratner said that we are in for a lot of surprises. He said, there are all kinds of things that are going to happen this year. And from my standpoint, I think they will all be very, very dangerous, escalatory.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap up now. If you could pop your email address in the chat if you care to do so. People have been asking for it. I just wanted to say thank you to KJ. That was an incredibly informative presentation. Pound for pound, probably the most informative presentation we've ever had. Really, really informative. Want to thank you very much for coming and sharing this with us. Want to thank everybody for participating. And please come back next week. We're going to shift into discussing the banking crisis, which is not over. So come back next week and find out more about that. Thank you very much, KJ. We really appreciate your coming.
Thanks, KJ. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com. And the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.